Good afternoon. I'm John Wada. I'm Executive Fellow here at the Yale School of Management. And before that, I was with IBM for an eternity. I had the privilege of leading marketing and communications for a number of years there. And my job this afternoon is a delightful one. I get to ask questions, as you are too, of two highly accomplished chief marketing officers. On the far right, on my far right, Seth Farbman. He has a background at Ogilvy. He was the chief marketing officer at Gap, and he was Spotify's first ever chief marketing officer, a position he had all the way taking them public, or their version of going public. And he recently joined the Yale School of Management also as an executive in residence. David Rubin here is the New York Times first chief marketing officer, his current role. And before that, he had leadership roles in marketing at Unilever and at Pinterest. So part of what we're going to learn from Seth and David today is get the benefit of their experience across many different industries and enterprises and share that with you. I'm going to start with Seth. I mean, Gap. So Gap, founded in 1969 by a husband and wife, became one of those great brands, great retail experiences, and then fell off. And you went there when they were still down. And within, as I recall, a year or two, not long, they were coming back. And I guess first question for you here, since we're talking about throughout our whole conference, change and transformation. So what did you learn about what happened to Gap, and what did you learn being chief marketing officer there?
Sure. You know, when I joined, I guess one of the common phrases was that Gap had been the market share donor to the apparel industry for about a decade. And that's true. You think about the rapid shift in fashion. H&M, Zara in particular, really changed the way that people shopped and changed the expectations, more importantly, that customers had. You know, but Gap may have fallen behind, but it still had, it had legacy, it had sort of core American iconic value. It had way too many stores. We had to take care of that. But there was something to work with. But the fundamental problem was the company lost sight of really what it did and for whom. When I think about 1969, a husband and wife got together and had no experience in apparel and thought, let's get into this. Why? It was San Francisco during the height of the 60s, and denim, Levi's, had become the uniform for the generation, for the boomer generation. And they were shopping, Don Fisher was shopping, and jeans were sold in like department stores, and he just found it a terrible experience. So he thought, I bet there's a better way of doing this. So they entered a brand new industry, but what they really understood from the beginning was, indeed, it was about connecting with culture and connecting with the new beliefs of an incoming generation. And denim became the uniform of that generation. So Doris Fisher, she said early on, and I found this by going through the dusty archives of Gap and finding the original two-page business plan typed out, strike-throughs, you know, the whole thing. And in this two-page business plan, Doris said, I want to create a store with a heart. And again, pulling on culture, there was this understanding that the generation really had a large responsibility back to the world. And so when I saw all of this, I realized, well, here's the problem. You know, I'm Generation X. In the 90s, Gap was amazing. Gap was the uniform, the white T-shirt, Sharon Stone. If you're over the age of 35, you might remember this stuff. It was the uniform for my generation, just like it was the uniform of the boomer generation. When I got into Gap, I discovered that the average age of the customer was 39 years old. So 39 years old, that may not sound surprising or terrible, but if you think about what drives fashion, who buys clothing, it's not 39-year-olds, right? A 39-year-old man is settling into his golf shirt collection.
Be careful, Seth, careful.
Some say IBM. And so you had a mismatch of really what was core to the brand it provided was not closed. What it provided really was this uniform for a new generation, and they forgot a generation as the millennials came in. So then it just became a matter of, do we have permission? Well, all the stuff I found in the archives said these founders understood this role deeply. Is it still applicable today to the customer that we needed? Hell yeah. I mean, if you look at millennials as kind of the echo of the boomers, you guys have all done that research. You know that they share quite a bit. But the way you consume information, the way you share information, the way you think about the world, and the tools that you use had changed. So it took a year to change the clothes, because if you have a 39-year-old, then you start making those golf shirts and dad jeans, and nobody who is 25-year-old or 26 years old is going to buy them. So you change the product, but then you also change the marketing to be digital first, mobile first, more about curation, and just use the tools that exist. And when we did that, we found that the brand's promise of understanding and lifting up a generation was alive and well, and the thing just shot through the roof for a period of time.
Yeah. Now, of course, that memo, typewritten memo, that was handed to you during the job interview, right?
Yes.
No. So with an eye toward companies that are experiencing or fearing disruption and wanting to change and transform, you started in the archive.
Yeah.
So I'm going to turn now to David. You're with the company, so Gap 1969, New York Times, the middle of the 19th century. Iconic brand. I would say it's was being disrupted, the entire industry, for reasons actually we've talked about quite a bit, starting with Facebook this morning. So you're the first chief marketing officer. A, why did they create a chief marketing officer? And B, mirroring Seth's journey of discovery, a little bit of brand archaeology there. What did you learn and what did you do? What have you done with the New York Times brand?
Yeah, so why create the chief marketing officer is, so the Times has realized, the big shift you need to sort of process on the Times is that really transitioned to being a consumer product. We're a nonfiction Netflix, which is what I say when I have a couple of words, or I think probably a little more accurately, we're sort of if Netflix, Spotify, and HBO had a baby. A very cool baby, one you'd want to invest in, but a baby. And so if you think of us as that and not as a newspaper with an advertising business, you're much closer. And what the big difference there is that we move from an audience model, from a model where all I need you to do is read it once, and I need lots of people to read it once, and then I can monetize that, to a model where relationships are all that matter. Right? You're not going to subscribe to something ongoing if you're not using it regularly. And you're particularly not going to do that in an industry where most of our competitors are not charging at all. They're not even asking for you to log in, and we have to make you actually, we're a lot of work in that, against that kind of concept. And so they realize that in that world, and then couple that sort of business disruption and business challenge with the sort of larger context of the world, which is people are, even before the election, most recent election, people are questioning the role of the media. There's this concept even of the media, which is this sort of like saying mammals. Yes, tree slugs and humans are have something in common, I guess. Are tree slugs a mammal? Maybe not. All right, let's do something else. But they're not really. There's not a lot in common if they were competing, and that's really what the media has become. It's this, lots of things that have really nothing in common that are described one way, and in that world, why would you ever pay for something that's charging with all these things that aren't? And that's what then led them to say, we got to start telling our story. This world of just assuming you're going to read good journalism and then walk away thinking that the Times is better than all your other choices, it wasn't working. And that's what led them to say that in addition to having great journalism, which there is no substitute for and our first dollar has to go to, but then the second dollar has to go to making sure that you understand the difference of what you're seeing so that you then want to go seek it out and pay for it.
And the brand now is becoming something that you're actually marketing overtly. Mm-hmm. So tell us about the positioning of the New York Times around this idea of truth.
So, like I said before, historically, the Times' kind of approach was to give you good journalism and then market the business terms. 99 cents for 4 weeks, which if any of you have been following the Times for a long time, was our marketing for a long time. It was basically marketing the offer. And what we do now, and we still do lots of performance marketing, but we've really repositioned ourselves to say the only thing we have is our mission and our product. And so everything we do leads with the journalism or the journalist. And so, I did a similar exercise, an extra 100 years of archives to go through. But where we landed was that what the Times is about is we seek the truth and help people understand the world. Seek the truth is coming out of, is really the nuts and bolts of journalism, fourth estate, hold power to account, tell the story wherever it leads, that core journalistic ethos, the idea that we will print a story whether it's good for our business or it isn't. And then help people understand the world is got a couple of nuances. And so, of course, all news sources give you information, try to impart knowledge. What we think understanding is a key word in that sentence, because understanding probably takes multiple touch points. It probably takes different formats. It probably takes more work from you, the reader. And then the world has two connotations for us. One is the literal. There are very few news sources that have more journalists in more places, just the geographic world. But then it's also your world. The New York Times is providing journalism and applying the journalistic process from everything from politics through to cooking, meditation, business, and so your world, all the things you care about. And so with that as our sort of underpinning, and then in the backdrop of the election of November 2016, in early 2017, we decided to sort of talk about this idea of the truth is hard. And it sometimes gets sort of shorthanded as the truth. And we're really careful, at least in our own thinking. We're not trying to say that the Times is the truth. We're trying to say that you, the reader, are on a journey for the truth. And that the journalistic process is part of that journey for you. So the truth is really sort of shorthand for us for the journalistic process. And you need to be able to sort of stick that in there. Otherwise, we're sort of overpromising. Because we certainly aren't saying that we're the only source of truth or that we aren't going to make mistakes or any of those things. That's kind of how we shifted the.
Do you want to show a piece that may illustrate this position?
Sure. Can you pull up 20 to start? So just to show, this is what it used to look like. If we get there. So when I got there, I did an audit. This was our marketing. You can make the grumbles louder if you like. Yeah, thank you. Even if most of these pieces are halfway okay, there's no point of view, right? If we go forward, is this green button going to do it? This is sort of how our work looks now. Then this is the first ad. Some of you might have seen this. This was Oscars 2017, so March of 2017. We're 2 months after the inauguration, 5 months after the election, and we ran this.
The media needs to be
The truth is, we need to put the safety of the American
His
people.
refugee policy is a backdoor Muslim ban.
Celebrities are out of touch
Truth
with
is,
real
actors have a responsibility.
Terrific. We're going to come back to David in a moment, because what's the relationship between brand and performance marketing? Because like those, we were grumbling, groan about those 20% off sales, but you still have to bring subscribers in. And as you said a minute ago, a lot of people think everything on the internet should be for free. But Seth, okay, so you did brand archaeology at Gap when you got there, and you left Gap, and by the way, they fell off as soon as you left. You're recruited to be the first CMO for Spotify. The founder is not only alive, but he's your boss. And how do you go about this work of brand architecture, brand DNA, whatever you'd like to call it, once you get to Spotify?
If you don't know, the founder of Spotify, at the time I joined, was maybe 31 years old. Daniel Ek, from Stockholm, Sweden. Very introverted, an engineer, computer science person by trade, and a bit of a sort of an awkward genius. And so my job was really, instead of archaeology, was more about ideology, and to spend an enormous amount of time to understand and then to sort of codify this ideology. My first week on the job, I went to Stockholm, and this was my version of the archives. We set up 4 hours in the middle of the day, the two of us, and we said, no agenda. He'll share things with me. I'll ask him questions. We took Swedish walks, which is very necessary. If you live in Sweden, it's cold and dark almost all the time, so you tend to take these long walks during the 90 minutes of sunshine. And so we took long walks, you oxygenate the blood, you get it going. So we had these deep discussions around ideology. And the founder's story I found incredibly compelling. And it gave me enough to work with to understand why Spotify. Because if you listen to what the press said, and one of the problems with Spotify before I joined is, again, fairly Swedish, it's like, we're not going to talk about ourselves, right? That's who we are, that's our culture. And I have so much respect for it, but you have to manage your narrative actively in this world. And so most of the narrative about Spotify was the labels who own the IP, saying that Spotify didn't pay artists enough money, and that in fact what was going to happen is we were going to destroy the music industry. So fast forward 10 years, and the music industry's never done better, and it's in spite of the music industry. And so we had to get to this point where we were describing what our vision was. And the vision, the one that Daniel, when he went away for about 4 months to his mother's cabin in the north of Sweden during the winter with nothing but his guitar, he's a musician, and his servers, I don't know why you need plural, but he did. But the vision was that the music industry could be saved, because without proper distribution and access to music by everyone, for everyone, that what happened was the music industry really just looked at what is the safest music to produce, because all you had was the end cap at Target, right? And if you opened that up, then you would create, through software, the ability for an artist to find an audience, regardless of the genre and the type of art. And when you do that at scale, now we're talking well over 200 million people from nearly 70 countries, even obscure art can find a few million people, and a few million people can create livelihood. It can create a sustainable business for artists so that they can create more art. And that was at the core of it. How do we create more art and allow more artists to live off of it? Because the Medicis are dead, right? So when you get to that kind of narrative, then you start to see both how to develop a business strategy. So we built the artist side of the marketplace. We gave them access to the very same algorithms that allowed us to create wonderful experience for consumers. So now artists could see who their fans were, what they listened to, what they didn't, when they abandoned in the middle of a song, who else they were fans of, where they were concentrated. So now an artist who gets all of their revenue basically from touring and other things like merchandise could use that data to figure out where to tour, which cities, which had the greatest concentration of super fans, which means that they can sell faster and at a higher price, who they can have as an opening act or a feature on a track, and all of that data lifted it up. That's right. So to get to the business model, before you even get to the communications plan, you really had to understand what the nuance was in this relationship between art and fan. And it took a while. So you get that initial sort of stroke of maybe this is it, that intuition, and I believe you start with intuition and then you go and figure out, are you making this shit up or are you onto something? Then you get the data. Then you figure out if it makes sense to the right target audience. And once we did that, we discovered we actually had something pretty special.
Yeah. When I went to visit Seth about 6 months after he went to Spotify, he told me a version of the story, and then he showed me his brand architecture and his vision and the mission and basically a version of what David showed with the truth is hard. And he says, what do you think? And I said, I think it's brilliant. But I find it very interesting that in describing what Spotify is and what makes it special, you don't say the word music.
Yeah, that'd be too small. All right? I mean, music is the content that people consume and enjoy, but it's the role of music to produce music. So what's our role in being software? And for me, it just quickly became apparent that the company was not about access to music, which is what it was in the beginning and what it described itself as. You type in what you want, it appears, it's like magic, all the world's music in one place for the price of a single album. Great value proposition. But in fact, the role of the software was to create discovery. And for me, that was the key not only to the growth of Spotify, but through a growing audience base, but the growth of the music industry. And I thought about it, so why do we discover? What is like the human condition? Because we're explorers, right? Like, that's what happens when you're at the top of the food pyramid and you're kind of not getting eaten, then you turn your sights to other things. And its discovery is very core to like the human condition. How do people discover? Music is one of the ways. When you discover another culture, other ideas, you generally do it through an art form like music. It's very safe and it feels familiar. But it's not the only one. Think about film, think about travel, think about food. There are many ways that we engage with culture that allows us to discover more, which is incredibly fulfilling. So part two of that is people like to discover. It's incredibly hard to discover, especially in a digital environment where all the world's information is in one place, mostly unindexed before Google. But you want to be guided, but you want to be the one who discovered. There's a difference between blind curation and discovery where you now can tell everybody that you just discovered this Arabic hip hop artist. It's the greatest track. Drake is dead. This is the best stuff. We all know those people. Those are your early adopters, your lean in, your influential people. If you give them the ability to discover, just try to stop them from sharing, and now you have virality. Now you have a virtuous cycle. Now they're doing the marketing for you. And that seemed to be a really good place to scale a company as quickly as tech companies are expected to scale. Let others do it for us.
Yeah, I just want to, I've used that story many times in talking to business colleagues about disruption and why a lot of companies, particularly in technology, don't have second or third acts. And my observation is that it's how they define themselves from the beginning. And there isn't, for example, there isn't an automotive company in the world today that isn't crossing out automobile and putting in mobility, or insurance companies, crossing that out, putting in risk management, or in banks crossing that and putting in their, payments or something. So at the beginning, it's very seductive to say, well, the company name and our product are all the same thing. We're Slack, and the world's always going to want that thing. I don't think Steve Jobs said personal computer. I don't think Walt Disney said animated, films or cartoons. And I just find it very interesting that here a company that it's so tempting to say we're all about music or something that way, instead says fans and artists. And as Seth shared, and this is not a business plan statement, I trust, but with that, that's a passport into many other aspects of life and the economy
Yep.
because there are many artists and many fans, right, that
Right,
allow
and
you to continue to move and grow.
And if your core superpower is to enable discovery, you can apply that to all these other fields if you so choose. So now you've got economies of scale. And with data collection, now if I've got first-party data from food and travel and film and podcasts, you might have heard there's a big podcast acquisition by Spotify, and you put all that together in your first-party data alone, now you've got a big understanding of how people discover, why they discover, and now you're really onto something.
So David, coming back to the relationship of a powerful brand identity, powerful brand narrative with we need more subscribers, and great, you stop running those ads, but we still hold you accountable for subscribers, renewals, upsell, et cetera. So what is the relationship for you between brand and what is being called performance marketing?
Yeah, I mean, they're completely intertwined. Look, the Times and journalism are a tough business. I'm not saying anything you don't already know. We're doing better than most, and we're very proud of that, but like the future is still very murky. And we're a public company. It's not easy. You know, we just passed 4.5 million subscribers, which in some ways is 4 times what any pundit thought we would accomplish when we launched our pay model about 8 years ago. And on the other hand, is not a big number, right? What's Spotify now on paid subscribers?
Over 100.
Over 100, right. So, you know, absolutely 4.5 is not a big number. And so we have really hard targets that we've got to make all the time. And interestingly, what we found is we have been able to put that brand mission into the performance marketing, and it doesn't get worse. Sometimes it gets better, but more than anything, it doesn't get worse. And the reason that works for us then is that all the people who aren't taking action today are seeing something that reinforces the story we're trying to tell. And so when I first got there, there was this, oh, well, you know, if you make the ads more emotional, won't the numbers go up? And we had to resist that because we all know that this is what led to performance marketing, right? Leading with the offer is always going to do better if you only measure the next 7 days response or 24 hours response. So what we did was we changed it and we held ourselves accountable to don't reduce the performance. And so now we lead, you know, our basically what we've done is we've made our business and our mission the same thing. Whereas I think if you go back 3 or 4 or 5 years, they were 2 separate things.
Now you're collecting data, as we've heard from many speakers and panels today, about customers and about prospects and their behavior. What have you been able to tell or provide to the New York Times organization that they didn't already know about their, quote, customer?
Probably 2 things. One is how little the average person knows or probably cares about how journalism happens. This is true in any industry, but journalists are absolutely passionate about what they do, and they sometimes forget that they've got to tell other people what that is. And when you go to journalism school, the first thing you're taught is keep yourself out of the story. And in the modern world, people trust people and they trust the process. And without that transparency, people assume the worst, not the best. And that's a big leap for people who are trained journalists. And so trying to convince them to sort of lean forward with that, tell how the sausage is made, but to do it in a way that's compelling. I mean, fortunately, in the current environment, journalism is kind of sexy. And just look at some of the films that are being made, et cetera. And so people are interested. And so the second thing is the role that emotional plays in the process. And so one of the interesting things about the Times in the last decade and a half is that we've become a tech company too. I mean, we've got a lot of engineers. We've got 140 million monthly uniques. Yes, journalism is still the most important function within the company, but engineering is right behind it. We're a platform. And there's a big reliance on sort of data, and there's a thought that if you just make a good product, people will use it. And that they'll use it, and they'll use it for functional reasons. How many days did you read it? How many articles did you read? What were they? And one of the things we've realized, not surprising, but easy to forget, is that emotional matters too. And all you need to know is that on November 5th, 2016, to November 7th, 2017, to November 7th, 2016, 48 hours, the number of people subscribing to the Times took an exponential leap. And we didn't do a darn thing, right? Emotional is hugely important. Now, the thing we're on now is trying to figure out how can we not have to rely on an election to drive our results, because those can go the other way too.
For you, bad for the rest
Right,
of us.
yeah, exactly, yes.
Right?
I work at the Times, no comment. But how can we manufacture that emotional and lean into that emotional response so that people are feeling like, because we do know that a whole lot of people are subscribing, not just because of the value, and absolutely they have to get it or they won't keep paying, but they're also subscribing because of some emotional connection, because of how it makes them feel, because of what they think the role it plays in the world. And that is broad and different for different people, but still really important to tap into that.
So you're collecting data not only from the performance marketing campaigns and efforts, but also from the usage of the product itself.
Right.
Okay. Now let's turn to Spotify. I mean, most people would say Spotify is your new age company, platform, analytic, machine learning, et cetera. So is the marketing function at Spotify a data-first, analytics-first organization?
Well, when I got there, the answer was a clear no, because it had not been built for that at all. And so we had to spend nearly a year really just getting marketing technology and understanding our fan base in a different way, because the way that a marketer looks at data is very different than a product person, right? So, at first it was quite sort of reactive and very performance marketing focused, or product marketing focused, one of the two. But then when we started to make the shift, we understood that in the strategy, if you will, that I sort of outlined, the real key was to fully understand the relationship that people had with music and to find ways of deepening that relationship. And what that does is it creates deeper engagement, which creates more data, which means you know more stuff, which means you can do that over and over again. So we shifted the organization quite a bit, not just in the usual measurement. Yes, we did that, multi-touch attribution, which isn't real, of course. We all know that, right? Are we willing to admit that in public? It's directional, it's okay, but it's basically useless for any kind of precision, right? But I don't find that too much of a problem, because my view has always been that data is sort of an information source. It's an input that you then process and you decide what to do with it. And that's what we did at Spotify. So it resulted in a few things. Like we noticed, so for instance, one of the conundrums, if you will, early on that I noticed is, if I don't have signal, I can't give you an algorithm that actually delivers the promise that I just made in my ads. So I just told you it's going to be miraculous, right? It's just going to be like this piece of magic where you're going to discover music that you never would have discovered on your own, and you're going to love it. I don't know a damn thing about you when you first come in. It takes about a week or two to get enough signal so you feel like we know who you are, but that's the critical week or two. Think about anything you download. If it's not great, you just move on to the next, right? Your very, very short period of time of acceptance. So as an example, like what we did as a marketing point of view, we went in with a thesis that if I don't know anything about you but two things, where you grew up and your age, which is easy to get, then we could know enough to do one of the most powerfully emotional things, trigger your nostalgia response. If I know what year you were born, I know when you were 17. So the data scientists looked across the world for when do we have the strongest emotional pull. And regardless of any other one of your factors, where you grew up, socioeconomic, whatever, around 17 and a half years old, usually senior year in high school, you will never forget the music. And it will pull things out of you that maybe you've tried to bury for a long time. So, yeah. Yeah, I don't like going back there. I just had a moment. But anyway, so we created this thing called Time Capsule, and we got the product team to create a feature that allowed you to re-explore and rediscover that time of your life, and even if it wasn't your music and you were laughing at it, it's still created. That's the role of data. We also use it to inform advertising, marketing. Can we go to the front of this? I'll show you a couple. So we wanted not to ever tell Spotify stories because we had the data, so why don't we tell fan stories in the relationship? So we started to data mine for these narratives. And what is so interesting is most people say, well, how did you find all of this, this sort of meaningful story behind the behavior? So not just the behavior, but the thing is, people tell you all the time, when you create a playlist, you name the playlist. So we thought, why don't we just do ads that name playlists? Like this one. I don't know how to make a playlist. It's a playlist that someone made somehow. Right? Or this one. Worst playlist ever is 20 more followers than best playlist in the universe. Someone made a playlist called Low Battery. Very quickly, we're guessing. Right? And then someone made a playlist called Sorry I Lost Your Cat when they could have been making flyers. So we learned a lot about this, but then we started to think, like, what if you take it out of an individual and talk about communities? Community can be a country, it can be anything, a fan base. And so we started to then use the same methodology, data mining, clever storytelling, point of view, a little bit of humor. And we came up with things like this. Dear person in Venice who listened to Adele for 4 straight hours on Valentine's Day. You okay? Right? Dear person in Shoreditch, which is London, in case you don't know, who streamed It's the End of the World as we know it 11 times a day of Brexit. Hang in there. This one won't go away. This one keeps coming back, right, with Brexit. And our role here is to sort of expose the relationship and show empathy. Hang in there, right? Just a few more for fun. 2018 goals, deliver Burns as well as the person stream Bad Liar 86 times a day. Sean Spicer resign. Allows us to be political without being too political. Or this, if you don't know, Canada Land is a very popular podcast. Be proud of Canada Land. Luckily, our U.S. neighbors make it easy. 2 more quick ones. Take a page from the 3,445 people who streamed the Boozy Brunch playlist on a Wednesday this year. But make sure you avoid the medical professionals who added these songs to their operating room playlist. Stressed Out, Can't Feel My Face, Stairway to Heaven. Okay. So when people talk about data, especially in a creative environment, usually, and the question came up earlier, usually that feels in conflict. How can you create outstanding, compelling messaging and creative ideas when you're being like just hamstrung by all this damn data? All data is an actual, true, real, honest insight into people's relationships with things, their behaviors, their beliefs. People lie to you when you ask them questions. But if you observe and you still have this view of, again, care and empathy, you're not ever making fun of someone, but you're raising it up to be shared and shown. It works over and over and over and over. And that's the role of data at Spotify.
Excellent. So I'm going to ask David a related question, and right after that, we're going to turn to you for any questions you might have. I hope you do. I'm sure you do. So Seth mentioned that data helped with product innovation at Spotify with the Time Capsule product. You have church and state in the major media business, and it's been there for a very long time, and that's a very hard real wall, publisher, editorial. But yet you're collecting all this data. You have all this knowledge about the customer, the reader, the prospect, and so forth. Do you ever get involved with what we might recognize as product innovation?
Yeah, totally. I mean, the Times, there's sort of 3 concepts. There's marketing, there's product, and then there's the journalism. And so you sort of have to keep, product becomes a weird word because historically in the newspaper world, the product was the articles itself. And now there's also there's the interface, which is a little different and not made by a journalist. It's made by an engineer. So we're definitely involved in the product experience. In the journalism, we do get involved in the sense of like, what's the direction we're going? And who's the audience that we think we're speaking for? What we don't get involved in by design is any single piece of journalism, right? What should that headline be, or what should that article be, or should we write that story or don't write that story? Because the Times will publish things whether the audience wants it or not, whether the business interests are there or not. And interestingly, the ability to do that, we actually then turn into a marketing story, right? Because people want journalism that'll challenge their thinking. I think that when I was listening to Seth's story, the thing that resonated with me was how in a modern product world, and we both, I worked at Pinterest as well, there's this thought that they're engineering driven, and they are for sure, but this interplay between engineering and marketing and sort of how marketing can actually shape where the product is going, from music to actual discovery, or in the Times' case, from sort of journalism and an atomic experience to this idea of understanding and linking things together. When I was at Pinterest, the marketing need was to pull ourselves apart from social media. Even 3 years ago, 4 years ago when I got there, people didn't like social media. Imagine what it's like now. They didn't trust it, but they liked search, right? They liked finding things. And so Pinterest, which had grown up as both a crafting site and a social media site, neither of those things met its big ambitions. How did it turn itself to being about finding ideas to go do things? The catalog of ideas is what they ended up on. That was a marketing concept. But taking that marketing concept, the product has now completely morphed so that it now follows it. And now when you use Pinterest, it's much less about social sharing and much less about you telling others and more about you being able to find your own. And that's worked as the business has sort of reaccelerated and into their recent successful IPO. That positioning is really pulling it apart from other choices, and how it's both sort of driving the product, but then also the product is driving the marketing. It's sort of hard to pull them apart.
Your questions?
Hi, thank you very much for taking my question. Can you tell me how you think about prospects and customers differently, and if so, how?
Sure. So, I think that I'm going to answer this sort of broadly, then we can dig in a little bit. So my view is that really the most important role of marketing is not to extract value, but to create value. So if, like at Spotify, we were constantly looking at new ways to add more, and whether that's a new feature, whether that's a new sort of property like a Discover Weekly, or when we understood your algorithms better, we could recommend to you the artists that you seem to love who are coming to your local city and get you early access to tickets. So my view is that that's kind of your first priority, especially in what we think of as a platform or a marketplace, because it's really about the health of the community. If you're constantly creating a healthy community that engages more, shares more, then they become your acquisition channel. So I spent some time at AT&T back in the day, and it was an impression. It's like, it's never left me that we just didn't care on day one. We got the customer, crappy customer care, the product didn't work, but who cares? We had them locked in for a year or two. And it just seems so wrong. And I was so upset by this for some reason that I actually went to the CEO and I said, I want to take all of our acquisition budget and I want to put it in customer care and loyalty, CRM, all that. Let's just serve like hell. And he's like, okay, see you when we're out of business next quarter. And I don't believe that that's actually true, but we become addicted to growth, which often means that we'll do whatever it takes to bring in a customer. Performance marketing will let you do that, but performance marketing that is not connected with a value proposition that is emotional and part of the brand brings people in who are not qualified, they bang around for a while, they waste your time and money, and then they leave. Is it their fault? No, it's yours because you didn't have the patience and the value for the customer base that you have to really pre-qualify, make sure that what you have to offer is what they want, and you end up weakening the existing environment, the health of your community.
The Times is really interesting for that because we have 120 to 140 million readers every month, and we have 4.5 million of them pay us anything. So the other, somebody do the math, 115 million people, yes, we get some ad dollars, but it doesn't support their experience in full. So we're losing money on the other 115 million people. And what's interesting is most of them like the article they're reading fairly equally, right? The difference between the reader and the subscriber, particularly with accepting the part who feel they can't afford the price, which is only a small fraction. The rest of them is that they don't believe that the reader doesn't believe that what they're getting is so different from anywhere else that they have to go pay for it. And so they like the Times, and they would maybe even many of them rather read the Times choice, but like that much more, you know? And so for us, it's a combination of understanding what would make you think that that's different and really not something I can get somewhere else, and a bit of this, which is understanding that not only, because look, the reality is you cannot pay for it, right? And so you have to believe that that's sort of long-term not gonna be in your interest because we're gonna go away. And then and other things like us are gonna go away, and then the whole quality is gonna go down. The nice thing for us is that the last few years have really shown that if you see, say, a platform, particularly say like a Facebook, as your main source, I think we all know that that doesn't surface the quality that you're looking for. That doesn't leave you feeling like you've really understood what's going on in the world. And so that more people, I think, now know that, and it helped. Who knew? You get what you pay for.
Ravi this morning mentioned this is the 14th Customer Insights Conference, and I think I've been to just about every one of them. And the reason I mention that is because from a historical perspective, and even this morning, a lot of discussion about data and ideas, or data and art and science, right? Ever heard that from everybody? But I think in just looking at the Spotify work and looking at the New York Times work, I mean, to me, this is not an even proposition. Yes, your work is informed by data, but it's the brilliance of the creative that sets it apart and is going to help set you apart. As a professor, I've done some work with the Chrysler people, and Olivier Francois, the Frenchman who runs a lot of the Chrysler marketing in the last 10 years, says the most important thing about communication in this era is awareness. Unless you break through, you're talking to yourself, and you're wasting money. As efficient, as zero-based budgeting as it goes, you've got to break through. You've got to gain awareness. And I think that, to me, it's like, talk about art and science and all the thing. It's still, who came up with those ads? And I'll bet they weren't, copy tested with 10 people in a suburban shopping mall and ask people, anybody who likes these ads, who doesn't like these ads, because there'll be people who don't like those ads and people who don't like the New York Times ad. I guarantee it. But somebody's got to have, as you mentioned, a point of view, stand up, this is what we believe is going to work. Yes, we'll get the information from the data. Data is very useful. But at some point, someone's got to step into the water and take that chance.
Amen.
And I wish there was a presentation that said, love the data, important the data, but let's not lose sight of what we ultimately want to get to. And it's that sort of stuff.
Amen.
Yeah.
I mean, I couldn't agree more, right? The way, like, in the tech world, people talk about 10x. You know, how do you just create exponential growth? And if you focus essentially on very smart data-driven performance marketing, you're going to have really strong incremental growth. But 10x comes from creativity, innovation, and a very, very strong point of view to break through. And it's tricky. It's one of the things I think that's led tech down a bad path right now. Is it's sort of growth for growth's sake and at all costs. And it's I think we're having a bit of a sort of a centering of the pendulum, right? The beginning of marketing was all about message, but people didn't understand the role of medium, so it was very interruptive. Then we were all about, the medium, and now we can interrupt you at exactly the right moment on the right channel at the right time, all of that stuff. But then we gave them shit. So they were, people are pissed off at that. But if you use all of that great data and understanding and then give something that's worthwhile, it doesn't feel like advertising or marketing at all. It feels like content. It feels like information. It feels useful. You're like, thank you. And that's the social contract we made between marketer and customer that many have ignored, I think, to their peril.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's interesting. Performance marketing, despite how it was billed, has not taken brand or creativity and made it irrelevant. It's actually made it, I think, more important. It's not still important, it's more important. And the reality is that while performance marketing not doing it is a real issue, doing it is a bit of a commodity. And so how are you going to stand out against that commodity? You're going to stand out because you're doing it and you're doing it really well, but you're also doing it with some level of here. And anyone who's forgetting that is leaving something on the table and is going to get their lunch eaten by somebody who isn't. I mean, it's interesting. Many of the best performance marketers in the world, companies like Warby Parker and Harry's, are all also great branding companies. Spotify. And so I don't think there's this choice. I think that's why you hear art and science, but I agree with you that sometimes gets then dumbed down to meaning that like everything's equal and it's all used at the same time. And I think creativity, you're absolutely right. Data is important to inform creativity, but it always was. We did research, right? I think a lot of the performance and the data is about the delivery of the message. It's about taking that message and making sure that it's tailored for the right people at the right place and not putting it here and putting it there and not putting it then and putting it now. But the creativity still becomes the thing you have to start with. And it is the hardest thing. And you don't have it and you can't timeline it, which is the other hard part.
And context as well.
Absolutely.
I mean,
So.
the Academy Awards is a lot different than putting it on.
Absolutely. Totally.
We've got less than 3 minutes. I really want to close by taking advantage of the experience here. So I want to ask you, one of those dumb questions, but I think they're useful. So Seth, right? You've been in marketing for a while, a big agency, Gap, Spotify. What would you say to young Seth about what you've learned for your journey?
Pick a different career. You know what?
Okay.
That's only like half a joke, actually. But what I would say is really just to do what seems like two sort of contrarian things at the same time. One is to have an absolute point of view of what you believe is right for the business, right for the customer, right for the messaging. Marketers sit on top of an enormously powerful platform. We shape culture, right? We tell people what's right and wrong, fundamentally. We tell them how to think about themselves. It's very powerful, so you have to have a clear point of view. But then The other thing I would tell my old self or my young self is then to just like follow sort of almost irrational curiosity. Like I think the first half of my career, I focused on being a better marketer, which meant I focused on the tools, I focused on learning, I focused on company, I focused on understanding the customer. But really where your real sort of ideation is fueled is by looking in the tangential, looking at systems, looking at psychology, sociology, and really just fully understanding how we live all together on the planet and then applying that down the road. But I didn't have the patience to have conversations that didn't have a direct purpose to the thing I was trying to do or sell.
Probably two things. The first is I think we were sort of talking about this, but I think the best marketing makes people take a stand. I think we then take that and think that means they have to take a stand to like you. And I don't even think that even matters that much. It's gotten even more true, but just making people feel like they got to have a reaction to it. And don't be afraid to do that, and that takes risks. And worry about that more. Have we made them feel some way about it more so than is it going to drive, what is it going to drive right this second? And then I think career-wise, I didn't do this on purpose, so probably the best advice I'd give myself is don't worry about having a plan. I would never have scripted myself from deodorant to the New York Times. I know, I'm sure the rest of you can see it very clearly, but I couldn't. So not having a plan and then being willing to sort of go with it as it goes. But the first half of my career, I think I spent sort of learning fundamentals. I spent learning sort of the classics of how things are done. And I prided myself on never listening to those rules, but it was, I was in an organization where that's what I was learning. And then my last 5 years at Pinterest and the Times have been in a place where marketing isn't actually the center of the org at all. It's been a place where you have to actually make, you start in the door. I mean, the first day at Pinterest, I can't tell you how many engineers walked up to me and said, marketing doesn't work. I'm like, you're all wearing the same shoes. But in that world, and I probably wouldn't go back and redo what I did, with my Unilever career. But looking now, I personally enjoy working in a place where marketing isn't the center of the org. It makes you be much better at your craft. You have to be able to explain it to people who don't know the words and don't know the vocabulary. You have to be able to answer the why, not just the how. And I find that more fun. I probably couldn't do it if I hadn't done the first job well, but being able to do that and then pivot, it's scary, and there are days when it's really annoying. But big picture, it's really rewarding.
David, Seth, thanks very much.
Thanks, John. Thank you.